Hello Redditors, welcome back to Tales Against Humanity. Now, let's get started. In today's episode, throw your trash in my yard. Enjoy moving. Long after I was unemployed, this guy scammed me. Revenge is still pouring on him. Cancel a land lease and hope to make a windfall. Hope you like a lot of dirt. My now ex-neighbor was pretty trashy. Cars sitting on blocks in the yard, cigarette hanging out of her mouth while she's 9 months pregnant, blasting Kid Rock, tunes level trashy. Well, this lady decided that paying $1.00 per trash bag was just too much. Our township will only pick up your trash if it is in one of the approved purple bags though. So normal trash bags will just be left behind. The trash truck drives right past them. Her solution: buy normal trash bags at the dollar store and have her 8-year-old child toss them over the fence into my yard. Now their trash is my problem. After confronting her, she just laughed. So I called the cops. They said that since the kid was so young, and there was no proof his parents told him to do it, there was nothing they could do. So this went on for about 4 months. Me taking the bags of trash they toss into my yard, wrapping them in purple bags that I paid out of pocket for, and putting them out to the curb. Pretty fucking annoying. Not to mention the extra $3 or so a week I'm spending on trash bags. I'm slowly growing to hate this woman. It was annoying at first, but I was getting mad. Mind you, I own my home, and she was renting hers. So I get a hold of their landlord, and I offered to buy the house for a decent amount above market value, 17%. He jumps at the offer, and soon I am the proud owner of the house next door to me. Sure, it cost me $71K, but what price do you put on peace of mind? Very first thing I did was serve them an eviction notice in person across that same fence they like to throw trash over. That was 31 days ago. As of today, the unit is empty. I don't know where they went, but they're someone else's problem now. All because she didn't want to pay for her own trash bags. I think I'm going to knock that house down and make my yard bigger. I've been wanting to put in a handball court. Note for the profile stalkers: this is not the same. Neighbor with the husky. I like those neighbors. Story 2. Long after I was unemployed, this guy scammed me. Revenge is still pouring on him. First and foremost, this didn't happen in the US. Some events might be pursuable up there, but down here, it was mostly no man's land regarding the kind of scams I fell for. For the sake of this story, here in no man's land we use the top-level domain NML. My wife is a nurse. Back then, in the early 2000s, she worked in an ICU of a relatively exclusive and therefore expensive hospital. Specifically, she had to care for patients that had undergone cardiac surgery. At the same time, I was working for a small company that was going out of business. The owners were retiring. We hadn't secured any important contracts lately, and in my country you have to pay for employee severance unless you file for bankruptcy, so they decided to shut down while they still had enough cash to pay our severances. One day my wife calls me and tells me about this gentleman in his late 50s that had been on the verge of passing away, and after that close call he was so grateful and stuff. We'll call him Benny Lowy. This gentleman happened to work in electronic imports, which gave him access to incredibly convenient deals. Long story short, he was so grateful he could sell us an LCD TV, a store demo unit that had been used just once, and we'd need to pay like 1/4 of its retail price, as long as we kept it quiet because he was risking his relation with the brand. It caught me off guard. I said yes and she paid. Anyway, the only TV in the house had been a wedding present and weighted over 100 lb. We were eager to replace it. I was naive, I know, but I thought, being her patient, she knew all personal data from this guy, so it seemed unlikely he would target her for a scam. His father was a known businessman. Now retired and approaching his 80s, Mr. Lowy SR was well respected in his community and wouldn't have let his son wreak havoc. Also, my wife had acquaintances in common with Benny's brother, a known doctor of another hospital. Christmas was approaching. She asked Benny, who had been already discharged and back home, for advice regarding the present she wanted to give me: a phone. He hooked her up with the best she could think of. Now, I can't remember the exact model, but it was of the Sony Ericsson flagship and it wasn't yet offered by local carriers. He had access to it because of his status as local representative for said brand. She went with it. Paid. The job position: I've said my employer was shutting down, so just for the sake of it, she asked Benny if he knew of someone needing an IT guy. Of course, he said. I'll meet your husband at this place tomorrow, etc. And there I was, in a gas station uptown. He pulled over in a luxury car. Mr. Lowy was a normal-looking guy, used a cane and had a noticeable knee or hip pain. We sat down in the gas station coffee shop, and he told me about a mid-management position, reporting to him, in a mining company I had barely heard about. He coached me on what should I say in the upcoming job interview. We spoke about salary. I was dazzled. Wait, mining? Didn't you say he was into imports? He was that kind of guy you can't pause to question because he'd already thrown something extra to the mix in this position, had a better paycheck than the one I was being laid off. In the next days, we had a few phone calls. Stuff looked promising. I had been already laid off. We agreed he'd pick me up on deck 24th, and he's introduced me to senior managers as the recommended help desk junior manager. I woke up extra early, put on my best suit, waited in the front yard. Hours went by. I had planned to be back before noon to arrange stuff for that night's dinner. BC, my parents were coming over. After calling him repeatedly, he told me he had been assaulted and robbed. They took my cane and broke it on my knee, he wailed. Poor guy. I told him to forget about my interview for the time being. No, I promised you. I'll make it up to you. Of course, since he had been injured, he wasn't able to deliver the items my wife bought from him. That night my mother asked me about the new job. I could not bring myself to tell her about the delay. I told her it was going fine. That night I Googled him. Nothing showed up except for some awards in the Imports and Customs Associations of whatever. He called me to reschedule our interview, deck 31st. Again, picture me in my best suit outside my house on a summer morning. Of course, he didn't show up. When I finally reach him, he tells me that, when his car had been stolen last week, they took his wallet too, which these thugs eventually dropped during another robbery. So now he had been detained as a suspect for that. He hadn't been able to pick the imported electronics on the customs office, so they had them moved to another custody unit where it would take a couple of weeks to retrieve. That night, we went to my parents for New Year's Eve, and my mother asked me for the new job. It's all fine, I said. I Googled him again, this time with variations regarding his name or the supposed company he was setting me into. Not much showed up. Nothing shady. The next call was like a week later. He told me that, because he was being involved in a police investigation, this mining company had fired him. But this was actually good, because now I was going to be interviewed to take his position as IT manager. This meant double my former paycheck and securing a position that would be a leap forward in my career. So I don't ask many questions, I was just grateful. All those delays in the end would pay off. This situation, as you have already figured out, went on and on for weeks. My interview never happened. The electronics never arrived. We had lost our money, our time, our Christmas, our hopes, and I was still unemployed and hadn't been applying for job offers since I had this one allegedly secured. I texted him somewhere in between. I texted him, "Why are you doing this to us?" He texted back, "If I wanted to, you have nothing on me. But if you stick with me, you'll be rewarded tenfold." Cue in. The detective time went by. Eventually, my wife overhears from a coworker about this patient in another hospital she was working at. Some nurses do work part-time at other hospitals. She had fell for it too, but her husband was a detective, so a few hours later we were. Soon enough, he was detained, this time for real, and admitted to have been scamming people due to an impromptu invented mild dementia. This detective talks him into an off-court deal in which he gave us back every cent, but not my time nor hopes, in exchange for us not pursuing any legal action. This was a decent deal because us, having failed to make a written agreement on any of these purchases, had at most a week claim to our money. BTW, the money with which he paid us. He had to borrow from this father and some from his brother, the doctor. Remember, this didn't happen in the U.S. This agreement is actually completely legal down here. So I made a blog. This part I rewrote to clarify events and consequences on our legal system. I couldn't go for any further legal action, but there wasn't a non-disclosure agreement whatsoever. And I thought, what could prevent other people falling into this scammer's lies? Well, perhaps some Google results. I was in a unique position to tell my story without risking a legal backslash, so I created a blog on WordPress.com. Think something like BennyLowyTheScammer.wordpress.com. It was a single post in third person telling my story. The site's admin, me of course, closing words were, "Has it happened to you?" In the following days, that post comments had a dozen stories much like mine. For each comment that deserved to be a story of its own, with due permission from its author, I turned those to a post with a brief intro. a testimony from Javiera from X City. Each one eventually had comments and so on. Since civil action court filings, as opposed to criminal courts, are public in my country, you can dig into ongoing class actions and recent settlements. I found out 7 years later he tried suing the contact for WordPress.nml, our local fictional TLD, on the grounds of undermining existing, past and potential activity for the plaintiff. I'd say that part is true. To this day, if you Google for Benny Lowy, that blog will be the first result. It has been for the last 15 years. The case, of course, was dropped, but he took it to appeals and then to Supreme Court. There is another entry filed under a different local court, promptly dismissed, and whose expedient closes with his lawyer apologizing to Automatic.com for any past or future inconvenience related to this case, and whose verdict rules Benny Lowy had to pay also for the sued party attorney's fee. There is a third suit. It was filed by his former lawyer, to whom he hadn't paid for the former civil actions. I was tempted then and there to set a post on this blog saying, "If I wanted to, you have nothing on me." However, I have never attempted to let him know who's doing this. And you know, I feel sorry for him, but every time I consider taking the blog down, I log in again. Today I did, after 4 years, and see he's still doing it. Those comments I turned into posts, of course. Even knowing that I'm legally covered, the fact that I haven't ever been contacted tells me he's done this to so many people we wouldn't know where to start. All of his victims or scam targets are people in a vulnerable moment of their life or a rough patch. Unemployed guys, small startups looking for an angel investor, small branch salespeople pursuing a promising commission. Those who have, in time, reached a compensation or agreement, it's because Benny's now ancient father had to chip in. From what they say, his brother has gone no contact, but it's still the one they go to before suing. Most of commenters leave their email addresses, and I have known of a few that have teamed with each other and succeeded in legal actions. But even if they hadn't, they have a place to rant, and their rants are still the first result in Google if you look for him. Perhaps this is not a revenge, but it's my story. Edit for clarification, so common questions aren't lost in comments. This guy's father was well respected in the Jewish community, but had by this point disowned Benny. He chipped in to bail him from jail as did his brother, or to spare him jail when an agreement was at hand. In my case, it seems the cashier check we finally cashed in was in the name of his father. I am not sure, but it's not like old Mr. Louis involved himself in any conflict his son would come to. I made a blog, an intro article saying, "This is a place where victims of Benny Lowy can leave their testimony." And mine was the first, and by then, the only post. It was a story told from the point of view of a random visitor that happened to cross Benny Lowy in the past. Things would only catch momentum when comments to this post told just what you'd think. He had a long streak of doing the same, in different variations. I contacted authors, requested for permission to promote their comments to posts, Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V. Proceeded with a brief intro like, one of our readers wanted to share his story. Just to mention one of Lowy's scams that took place after mine. Now, this blog tells, for example, about the way he lied his way up to being hired as chief academic officer for the IT engineering career in a small but prestigious university. In that position, according to testimonies, he pulled of two big scams. He's acquired expensive equipments, think Silicon Graphics mainframes, acting on that university behalf. Those rigs never ever came to the school. Besides, you don't need such a machine to learn Pascal. Eventually, when providers expected for the invoices to be paid, the first units weren't even disputed by that university, then verification layers. But as those invoices kept coming, things blew off. Additionally, he had been charging his students an average USD 100 fee to set them up for some kind of training, either in Windows usage or Office usage in the Lilks, that turned out to be free programs sponsored by our local government. Of course, one fine day we left without a trace. In that position, he then contacted an old childhood friend, just to ask how he was, if there was anything he needed help for. This guy was in a rough patch, divorced, living from his savings, and struggling to pay for his son's oncoming year college money. By hey, this kid wanted to be in the IT field, so of course, this time the scam was a never-ending and convoluted way to make his son slip through the university tuition benefits programs so you would get a full-paid scholarship. Rest assured, given how costly tuition can be, this guy had to give Louis money to pay for documents to be put on top of the pile, or if something was missing, to make it pass unnoticed. Again, one day he just ghosted, but not before telling him. It seems I crossed the line in trying to help you. I was fired from the university, and they are suing me for trying to promote your kid's application for full scholarship benefit. I'll need to fly low for a time. Story 3. Cancel a land lease and hope to make a windfall. Hope you like a lot of dirt. Let me preface this by noting that this revenge was not my doing. At least, not exactly. It happened back in the 90s when I was in high school and centered around the type of school I attended. So, in case you weren't aware, it's very common in agricultural communities to have what are known as farmers' schools. That's not a technical term, but more just something easy to define them. The schools are generally organized by the local farmers, and while you still study the various courses needed to get into college, you also study farming technology courses and get credit hours for work study, i.e. working on one or more farms. The area I lived in was surrounded by a number of large farms which grew cotton primarily. So during the year, we'd spend time out in the field both tilling, planting, and harvesting. One of the farms near the school was this 1,000-acre spread that, like the others, grew mostly cotton, though sometimes they rotated to soybeans or silage. Basically corn, but you don't harvest it. This farm had a long partnership with the school, so the students provided near free labor for the farmer. The farmer leased this property from some out-of-state owner and paid them a portion of the revenue from the harvest. Imagine my surprise then when I and many of my classmates arrived at the farm to do our work study, and the farmer instructed some to crew the sprayers and start spraying herbicide on the fields, while others, myself included, were to take tractors and discs and plow everything under. The farmer wanted every square inch of the fields returned to just dirt. We were shocked, to say the least, but after some discussion, we set to work. It took us the better part of a weekend to do so, and when we were done the field was in a beautiful, if barren, state. The farmer thanked each of us personally and paid us about $500 each. Quite the sum for a 90s high school senior. We returned to the school, told our headmaster that the contract was completed, and he informed us that the farmer would no longer be working with the school, and we'd be sent to one of the other larger farms for the rest of the year and our work study. It was probably 2 or 3 months later before word started going around about why we'd been instructed to destroy the crop. Granted, these were just rumors, but based on how things turned out for the farmer, I suspect there is some truth to it. So, apparently the landowner had decided that he was going to not renew the lease the farmer had on the land. This lease renewal just so happened to fall a few weeks before harvest season would start. Given that the average cotton farm earns about $1,500 per acre, a 1,000-acre farm would easily net the owner $1.5 million, about $500K of that being pure profit. I don't know what the farmer's lease was, but it stands to reason that it wasn't anywhere near that. So this landowner had figured out a neat little trick. Let the farmer get a good crop planted, and then refuse to renew the lease. The farmer would leave the plants in the field, and the landowner would just need to pay some contractors to come harvest it, and they'd earn a profit. Since at the time, the farmer's lease wasn't yet up, he decided to prevent that from happening. His act of revenge against the owner was to prevent them from cashing in on their hard work. Sure, it destroyed his farm, and he had to sell off most everything he owned to buy some property for himself, but he proved a point. The owner did try to sue the farmer, though he, the owner, really didn't have a leg to stand on, or so I was told. I think the court ruled that since the farmer was still under the lease when he had the land tilled under, then it was his property to do with as he wished, and thus the landowner couldn't tell him what to do with his property. I learned a rather valuable lesson from that man beyond what I learned about farming. That lesson was never, ever cross someone with nothing to lose. Edit. Since it was brought up in the comments, let me add some details here. Cotton is one of the few crops which leave a negative nutrient value in the soil, meaning that after harvest, even if you till the dead plants under, or even if you till them prior to harvest, you won't have as much nutrients as you started with. That's why farmers will plant another crop, usually winter wheat, in place, and then till it under rather than harvesting it. This is something commonly called a green manure, but it works to put nutrients that the cotton pulled out of the soil back into it. While the ground wouldn't have been completely dead or sterile, any crop planted on that tract of land, without further treatment of the soil, wouldn't have produced the same acre-per-acre yield that a comparable crop would have had he gone to harvest and planted the secondary crop. Which means that the landowner would either have to plant the green manure and spend money that way, or pay by the ton to use artificial fertilizer. Make sure to like and subscribe for more interesting stories.